You're dealing with one of the elemental forces of nature here, but unlike a hurricane or even a landslide or a flood or something, you can't see it. It's lying there in wait all the time, 24 hours a day. You might just be walking along minding your own business, and once it's got you, it's going to hurt you.
It conforms to every single nook and cranny of your body. You literally cannot pull yourself out, even sunk up to your ankles.
People have always been just terrified of the idea of quicksand. It's that awful feeling that somehow the ground which you know is solid and you walk on is somehow not there, and you're going to take a step and you're going to disappear.
Since the earliest days of the cinema, it was one of Hollywood's favorite ways to dispose of the bad guy or trap an innocent victim.
Let go the ropes. Ah!
Producers created bottomless pits of quicksand out of peat moss, oatmeal, even wine corks, and helped make the soggy stuff legendary. But quicksand is more than just a clever plot device.
The river of quicksand that no man had ever escaped alive. I'm sinking!
It's real, it's dangerous, and it's more common than most people believe. Quicksand is found along coastlines, on riverbanks, even in our own backyards. Though one of nature's deadliest traps, quicksand is made of just two basic ingredients: sand and water. It's a simple recipe for disaster. In 1997, 12-year-old Sarah Cody and a friend went for a stroll on what looked like a perfectly ordinary beach on the northwest coast of England.
We were staying at my Auntie Jackie's holiday flat for the weekend, me and my friend Georgina. We went out on the sand. We'd been out before, and there is actually signs saying quicksands, and it was a stupid thing to do, but you don't really think about that at the time. You think, oh, I'm not going to sink. It felt quite muddy at first, and it did feel like my feet were getting a bit stuck, but it just felt like walking in thick mud. And then it got kind of more liquidy. As I walked along, it was all of a sudden like a big pocket of quicksand that I stood into. It felt like it was sucking me, pulling me down into the sand. I tried to pull myself out, but that made me sink about twice as fast. And there was people shouting from the prom, stop struggling and just keep still. I sunk up to about here-ish, I think. And I remember at first my feet didn't feel like I had them anymore. There was loads of sand in my wellies and they were being dragged down. It was liquid, but it was going really hard where I was putting pressure onto the sand. It was just setting like concrete around me.
Sarah was mired deep in quicksand, only 150 feet from the shore. It looked just like the rest of the beach, but this particular patch of sand was different. Sarah was locked so firmly in place, she couldn't get out on her own. What we think of as solid ground, terra firma, isn't really solid at all. It's billions of separate granular particles resting on each other. Normally, that's all it is. But quicksand forms when rising water levels in the ground force the grains to lose contact, and they float apart, suspended in water. The liquefied sand can no longer support you, so down you go. As Sarah realized too late, struggling is a bad idea, as it only liquefies the ground even more, so you sink further. Trying to pull your legs up compacts the sand tightly, turning the water pressure into suction and locking your foot in place. The finer the particles in the quicksand, the tighter and more vice-like the grip. word of Sarah's predicament reached the Arnside Coast Guard, who handle some 30 quicksand rescues every year.
When I arrived on the promenade, I saw Gordon, one of my crew, already in there with Sarah, and she really was in a mess. She was really frightened. She was screaming, crying. She was just thrashing. All she wanted to do was get out. So I radioed, but still, we're just talking minutes.
After a while, there was all these people around me, and it was getting really, really panicky. There was loads of noise, and there was fire engines and police, and it seemed like it was taking forever.
Freeing a victim from quicksand without also getting trapped calls for special gear. The Arnside Coast Guard uses portable planks to cross the unstable sands and support their weight during the rescue.
They put a big wooden board over my head. It was like a big square with a hollow in the middle. And to pull me out, they pulled one leg out first. They basically dug my leg out with their arms. They put the one leg onto the board so I could leave my other leg out. And then I was sort of laying in the sand. Then they managed to get me out altogether. Then they just picked me up, just ran me across these boards to the shore, and I didn't touch the floor until I got to the ambulance. Since it happened, I've been back once. I came a bit onto the sands, but I stayed mostly by the rocks because I think I learnt my lesson the first time. It's not worth the hassle of all the people's jobs coming out and helping you, and really it's pointless going out there in the first place.
In this part of England, quicksand isn't limited to the beach where Sarah was trapped. The town of Arnside lies near the entrance to an enormous body of water called Morecambe Bay. The area is well known for its wildlife and scenic beauty. It is also notorious for some of the world's most dangerous quicksand.
Sands do look nice, don't they? And they look safe. They always look safe. To the layperson, it looks like any old sand. And that's, you know, it's hidden danger.
For centuries, Morecambe Bay at low tide has seduced unwary travelers, tempting them to risk their lives for a shortcut from one village to another by crossing the sands. More than 150 people are known to have perished attempting this journey. By itself, quicksand is not deadly, but it is the ultimate trap, locking its victim in place while some other force of nature finishes the job. In Morecambe Bay, it's a 30-foot tide.
You can never outrun it, really, because it never tires, the tide. There is a saying in this area that it can travel at the speed of a galloping horse. Well, even a horse can get tired, but the tide never does.
To help travelers more safely negotiate Morecambe Bay's massive tides and infamous quicksand, the British monarchy appointed the first official guide some 600 years ago. In 1963, Cedric Robinson became the latest in this long line of Queen's Guides to the Sands.
You can only know and read the sands from being brought up, such as I was, from a very early age. There's no way you can read a book and say, well, I know the route. It doesn't work like that. You have to know the sands intimately, and if it can catch you out there, it will do.
Cedric has lived and worked as a fisherman on Morecambe Bay for over 50 years, and he knows its perils better than most. His introduction to quicksand began at the age of 14.
I didn't want to do anything, only follow the sands for a living. Same as my father and my grandfather and even my grandmother. She was a fisherwoman.
Here on Morecambe Bay, fishing has always been a hazardous profession. At low tide, the bay is transformed into a wet desert, the fish more than 7 miles offshore. In the old days, locals harvested the sea from horse and cart, venturing out on the treacherous sands to set their nets and wait for the catch to roll in with the tide. Not everyone made it back to safe ground. Many foundered in quicksand, both horse and driver drowned by the returning tide as it surged over their heads. As the royal guide, one of Cedric's responsibilities is to educate the public to Morecambe Bay's risks by leading nature walks out on the sands. Before taking any group offshore, he surveys the exposed flats.
Come a fine day, even before setting foot on the sands, I can go up onto the tops with a marvellous view of the estuary, and I can look through the binoculars out there and scan the river down, and I can say to myself with my knowledge, well, that's the place to cross.
The danger spots are the lowest areas, where the meandering paths of rivers and streams carve narrow channels in the bay. Quicksand is formed by the action of the tides as it raises the water table beneath the bay, saturating and loosening the sand in and along these channels.
It looks just the same as any sand. It looks firm until you stand on it, and it just goes like jelly. And the more people as goes over that area, the more jelly it gets. But there are some areas out there that would be too frightening to go near them. But there are areas where you can go on and you can have fun with children.
It may seem unwise to mix kids and quicksand, but Cedric's hope is to prevent future tragedies by teaching children how to recognize it for themselves.
Have you ever been on quicksands before?
No.
You could get really stuck, couldn't you?
Yeah. Once you get about to that.
Yeah, that's it. It clings, doesn't it? And it's like a suction then, isn't it?
Yeah.
You see, it's bad there. And once you go on it, it's worse. But if you come back to that area in 2 hours, that water will come out and it'll have hardened up a little bit. And that's the danger. If you were in there for 2 hours, we wouldn't get you out because the water comes out and it sets just like concrete.
Quicksand is always the highlight of the walk, but Cedric makes sure the kids understand that ultimately it's a serious hazard.
After a certain time, one or two of them will get that little bit deeper, and then it gets past the exciting stage, someone can get stuck. So Cedric has to blow the whistle, say, come on now out of there. We don't want to lose any of you. Remember, girls, not too deep, otherwise you're there to stay.
Usually you find quicksand outside, a product of Mother Nature. But with the right ingredients and know-how, you can make your own. Scott Steedman understands quicksand better than most. He is a civil engineer who has spent his professional life studying the earth beneath our feet. At home in the kitchen, Scott has his own special recipe for quicksand.
This is corn flour, which people use for thickening gravy, and it shows just all the same properties as quicksand. Quite extraordinary. When you mix it with water, you can change it from this solid form into a liquid and back again. And let me just show you that, because I'll just put some more in, more than I need, and we'll see if we can't make a quicksand here in the kitchen. The corn flour is a hard and fine granular material, so it's a bit like sand or fine sand, but extremely fine. And so we can see in the mixture all the same properties that you see in a quicksand on the beach, but really in a small scale here in the glass. So this is the corn flour paste in its liquid form, and if I just stir the spoon slowly, you can see it's a liquid. Lift it up and it drips straight back in just like a liquid. But if I stab at it with the spoon quickly, like a person trying to run across the quicksand, they don't sink in. It's absolutely solid. It's undulating, but it's solid under the tip of the spoon. It's got all that strength to hold the person up. But if the person just stands still, it just sinks in. And then if I grab at the spoon and try and pull it out quickly, like I'm kicking with my legs in the quicksand, it's locked absolutely solid. And if I kick from side to side, I just can't get it out. It's absolutely stuck.
In the movies, getting stuck in quicksand was usually a terrifying experience, and the hapless victim went to extraordinary lengths to escape. But in reality, there are some people around who just can't wait to get into it.
These days, my experience with it is filming other people. People from all walks of lives, they bring themselves or their significant other, and they want to jump into a bottomless pit of quicksand to experience it. And I provide that.
Chuck Lang is making his own contribution to the B-movie genre.
Yeah, but be looking over your shoulder as you running, you know, like you hear the posse coming. You know, I mean, you want me to stand back here and fire a few shots over your head or something?
That's okay. I don't think I need that.
Chuck is in high demand for his directing skills and for his knack for finding quicksand along the banks of the Mississippi River. Chuck and his friends are just a few members of an emerging network of quicksand fanatics.
The competition is who can find quicksand first. And the game is, what do you do after you found it?
It's almost like you're chained to the ground all over. You have to move, you have to exercise a lot of energy just to move a little bit. Imagine yourself in molasses.
It's almost like an exercise. You are going to burn some calories, you really are.
To an outsider, playing around with a dangerous natural phenomenon may seem foolish. But after years of trial and error, these buffs have developed an impressive understanding of quicksand, its realities, and a few myths, including the ones Hollywood made up.
Don't believe what you saw on TV. You're not going to sink out of sight.
Perhaps it's the biggest myth of all, that you'll step into a pit of quicksand and disappear. But that's virtually impossible. You're actually more at risk in a pool of plain old water. Because humans are composed mainly of water, we won't stop sinking until we've displaced an amount equal to our own volume, and that puts us beneath the surface. Quicksand is twice as dense as water, so we won't sink nearly as far, only about chest deep. The quicksanders have a good time applying their knowledge of buoyancy, but generally, they don't tempt fate. Here on the Mississippi, the quicksand they play in is not the most dangerous. The sand grains are fairly large, so the grip is less vice-like. But just in case something does go wrong, they use the buddy system.
It's not a good idea to ever go out by yourself to look for quicksand, because if you find it and you do get stuck, you could be there a while.
Help!
Pat Benatar, We Live for Love, Monday morning on 1490 WESB 360.
Bruce Fife certainly wasn't out looking for quicksand when he stumbled into it one night in 1999 while chasing his dog. But find it he did in a very unlikely place.
Basically, it's dusk, 4th of July weekend, Friday, and I'm booking down 9 Mile, coming back with the dog, and got approximately a little past where the gravel pit is. She bolts out of the back of the truck, and I stopped the truck, took off through the sand piles after her. She went down the hill and got out onto where they dump all their sand trappings and stuff after they clean the rocks and gravel off, and it's real soft out there in spots, and I happened to find a soft spot. Ended up going in, and basically a couple hours later realized I was not getting out without any help.
Bruce found himself knee-deep in a peculiar kind of quicksand, an unexpected byproduct of the gravel industry. Water and fine sand particles from the mounds of crushed rock make this quicksand especially concrete-like and difficult to escape. Bruce was locked in and looking at an extended stay.
As my feet went into it and got locked, you could feel it encasing my feet and up part of my leg. From probably midpoint on my shins down to the bottoms of my feet, I couldn't feel anything. You know, it was just, they were dead. And I wasn't going forward, backwards, up, or down. And it was just, I was stuck. I think I resigned myself to the fact I was probably going to be there overnight. Because I had, very little traffic. Everybody's gone. I could hear the expressway traffic, but that's a couple miles away. And just think, well, I'll wait till morning and just start all over again. And we just got progressively hotter through the weekend. And by the third day, I did drink the water that was around me. And it was just to that point where I knew something was happening to me physically because I couldn't focus on anything.
Bruce was suffering from more than just dehydration and prolonged exposure. At this point, he'd been trapped for 3 days and 4 nights, more than 60 hours, and was dealing with a frightening effect of quicksand, a crushing pressure on his limbs. Moving his legs back and forth had compacted the quicksand. The pressure had increased until it actually cut off the blood supply to his legs. Eventually, Bruce lost all feeling in his lower extremities as the cells, nerves, and tissues were starved of essential oxygen and nutrients supplied by blood flow.
On the quicksand stuff, the material would be just like if you were squeezing on your legs as hard as this, but it went from his mid-thighs all the way down his leg, just a total squeeze down to around his foot and just kind of just squished it right up. I guess you can make a comparison to being in a vice-like situation.
Believe me, coming on to the third morning, I wanted out. I wanted to go home.
Bruce's endurance test finally came to an end when the sun rose on Tuesday morning.
I heard the machinery start up and I started screaming. And some guy popped up over the bank and he says, "How long you been here?" And I told him, and I said, "Roll the rescue squad and get me some water."
They tried digging with some shovels, but they really couldn't because we were worried about some injuries to his legs. So they dug with the screwdrivers a couple inches at a time, running their hands down his legs to make sure that they weren't poking into him because he couldn't feel his legs, like from the knees down to around his feet. He had no feeling in there from being compacted in for so long.
And as soon as my feet came free, they just pirouetted me up, got me down on the backboard, and got me out of there. But, you know, I was tired, I was hot, and I was just trying to stay with it. I didn't realize I had developed an infection. My kidneys had started to shut down. There was a lot of weird things wrong inside of me that I really couldn't tell. The big thing I knew was my feet were messed up.
Bruce's kidneys were treated and soon back to normal, but his feet were another matter. When tissues are starved of blood and oxygen long enough, they die, which can lead to gangrene. In the worst cases, toes or even legs are amputated.
Sometimes if I move my foot just right, I get a real bad twinge. And that could still be just tissue, scar tissue breaking apart and stuff like that. And the doc said, he said it could be a year before my feet are back to normal.
Time could have been Bruce's real enemy. But luckily, his rescuers reached him before permanent injury set in.
Go deep, Potts, go deep.
In a swamp north of Toronto, it was the combination of quicksand and cold Canadian weather that spelled disaster for 9-year-old Ethan Beattie. The nightmare began one chilly spring afternoon when Ethan and his friend Stephen took a wrong turn while playing in the backwoods near their homes.
I got stuck at one point and Stephen thought that me and Emma were behind him, so he went on and then we were separated. We were looking for this path that would take us back, but we ended up in the swamp.
As they searched for a way home, the ground beneath their feet began to give way.
It looked like it was solid, but when you stepped, you would start to sink. And it looks like it's shallow, but when you step in your leg, it will get deeper.
Stephen managed to find his way home and told his mother that Ethan and Elmo were still lost in the swamp. As darkness fell, police and local rescue squads organized an extensive search.
You could see the lights of the fire trucks and the police cars. There was lots of commotion, and you could see people massing down at the corner here, waiting to go in on foot to do a search.
The rescuers had their work cut out for them. Ethan had disappeared in the heart of a 3-square-mile swamp, and it was already dusk when the search began.
We'd also been informed by the police officers who had gone out ahead of time that there was quicksand. So there's a danger out there that we were actually told not to actually leave the boat unless we had a visual contact with the boy. You hope for the best, but you expect the worst. You don't want to go up there all pumped thinking you're going to find somebody alive, because if you don't, especially a child, if you don't find them alive, that's devastating.
For several hours, the rescue team scoured the swamp, but there were no signs of Ethan or the dog.
I can't imagine what a little 9-year-old boy is thinking when it starts to get dark. He can see the helicopter, he can hear the people looking for him. He can't answer because it's starting to get too cold, and he's gotten too far, he can't get back, he's getting stuck. The only thing he's got with him is his dog.
As the night wore on, Ethan's situation grew more desperate. Stuck in quicksand, his body trapped in near-freezing swamp water, he was in real danger of dying from exposure. Elmo the dog sensed Ethan was in trouble and stayed close to the boy.
When I got too cold, Elmo would lie on me, and when I was falling asleep, Elmo would lick my face so I would stay awake.
Every 15-20 seconds, we would call out his name, hoping that we would get a response.
Ethan!
More than 5 hours after the search began, the beam of Dave Pierce's spotlight reflected off the eyes of an animal crouched in the reeds.
We got probably within about 50 feet, and I was able to see a slightly black shape, and then we knew it was a dog.
Attaboy, attaboy.
When we came upon the boy, and when Dale shouted out, he's alive, boy, that was it. The adrenaline's pumping, and we're basically running across there to get to him. And to find him, still alive, still alert, okay, now we got a chance.
By now, Ethan was ice cold and extremely weak, sunk deep in the quicksand.
I was up to here in mud, and they were pulling me a lot to get me out.
But the soft, wet ground nearly thwarted the rescuers' efforts to free Ethan and get him into the boat.
Dale picked him up, he turned around, he took one step, and boom, he went down to his chest and into the quicksand. It scared the hell out of us. We knew it was there, but we didn't step in it before.
The men formed an assembly line, handing Ethan off to each other as they wrestled with the quicksand. They struggled for solid footing and slowly maneuvered back to their craft. It was close to 11 o'clock when the rescue team finally carried Ethan to shore. After 7 hours in the cold swamp, he was in a state of severe shock and deeply hypothermic. His body temperature had fallen to 86.9 degrees Fahrenheit, within just a few degrees of cardiac failure.
You want to get him inside to get him out of the wet stuff? Hey, baby, it's okay.
Had Ethan been in the quicksand much longer, he may not have survived. Wandering into swamps and getting stuck in quicksand is one thing. But Lil Judd certainly never expected to find it in her part of the world.
You've heard about quicksand, you hear about it, but that I'd be able to locate it basically in my backyard, no, that I didn't expect.
Though Hollywood has produced some pretty good fakes over the years, California seems an unlikely candidate for real quicksand. Of the two main ingredients, there's more than enough sand. But this dry state can be short on water. But in 1998, heavy rains had turned a normally dry gully just east of Hollywood into a quicksand trap.
We rode out on the sandbank, and we were standing out there for maybe 5 minutes, and he decided to take a step forward, and it had a drop. So suddenly, all of him was in, and I looked around and realized he had actually literally sunk, because as I'm trying to tell him to get up, he's trying to get up, but he can't. For a moment there, I just went panicky, and I just sat down next to him and started crying. And the thing with horses and animals in general, when they're in a panic situation like this, they will either give up or very possibly they'll go insane. So all I could do was hope he understood from my tone of voice, I gotta go, I gotta leave you, I can't get you out on my own, I have to get help. I'll be back, don't move, lay as still as you can.
Now Lil had to avoid getting herself trapped in the same quicksand that held her horse.
I ran across this area and kept sinking down to my hip. I just grabbed at whatever I could and pushed against whatever I could and just never allowed myself to remain too long in the same place.
Help was not long in coming, but once the rescue efforts had begun, Destin's situation quickly went from bad to worse.
He ends up in the stream, and all I could think was, oh my God, with all these people here, he's gonna drown. I'm gonna watch him drown.
We're gonna have to force him to move. Careful. Yeah, come on. Yeah, come on.
With a lot of encouragement, Destin was able to thrash his way out of the water. But the weight of his 1,600-pound body, concentrated on 4 narrow hooves, made it impossible for the horse to get out of the quicksand. As a last resort, a helicopter was brought in to airlift him to solid ground.
Somehow they managed to get this harness on him and they started lifting him. He is flying up in the air and he's slipping out of the harness. And I'm saying, put him down, put him down.
But the first place Destin landed wasn't solid enough to support his weight. He continued to flounder in the quicksand until his rescuers adjusted his harness and tried a second airlift.
No one ever said, you know, we can't save this horse. No one ever said that to me. And I'm sure a lot of people were thinking it when they saw what he looked like and where he was.
This time, the helicopter pilots gently lowered Destin onto firm ground. Despite 4 hours in quicksand and 2 precarious airlifts, the horse was unharmed. He was up and walking again in just minutes.
I am one very, very lucky horse owner, and he's one very, very lucky horse.
It's okay. I'm right here. Here's my boy.
Lil and Destin were fortunate. There were enough people, expertise, and technology to save the day. But that hasn't always been the case. In the 19th century, there were few resources available to American cowboys. While driving their herds of cattle, they encountered quicksand on a regular basis as they tried to ford sand-laden rivers. Hauling a 2-ton steer out of quicksand was no easy matter. The best they could do was try and pull the animals free with ropes. But unfortunately, things didn't always go like clockwork. As one weary cowboy put it, this last method saved many bogged-down cattle, but it tore the heads, horns, or legs off quite a few others. The cattle of the Old West were lost in small patches of quicksand, but sometimes quicksand can spread for miles and swallow a city. Perhaps the most remarkable case occurred in 1692. The city of Port Royal, Jamaica, at the time one of the wealthiest cities in the New World, was resting quietly on its foundation, a sandy spit of land 16 kilometers long. Just before noon on June 7th, a huge earthquake shook the ground with tremendous force. The violent motion pushed seawater up through the loose sand. In a process called liquefaction, the entire peninsula beneath Port Royal turned to quicksand. When the shaking finally stopped after 10 minutes, a third of the city had slid into the sea and 2,000 people were dead. The water had drained back out of the ground, locking people into graves of hardened quicksand. Written accounts from survivors describe some of the most horrifying moments.
No place suffered like Port Royal, where whole streets were swallowed up by the opening earth, and the houses and inhabitants went down together. Some were swallowed up to the neck, and then the earth shut upon them and squeezed them to death. Some are left buried with their heads above ground.
The shake opened the earth. The sea waters flew way up and carried the people in alive. I lost my husband, my son, and all ever I had in the world.
Port Royal went down more than 300 years ago, but despite the hazard, we still build cities on low-lying sandy areas near rivers or the sea. The phenomenon of liquefaction is a vital concern to engineers who must factor in the risk of quicksand conditions whenever they plan new construction in earthquake zones. At the University of Bristol in England, Scott Steedman uses models to demonstrate how buildings will react when the ground beneath turns to quicksand, as it did in Port Royal.
We're building a beach here to demonstrate some of the properties of quicksand. It's a special sort of quicksand because it's a quicksand that's formed in an earthquake. The shaking in an earthquake creates extra water pressure in the ground, and that boils up to the surface and produces all the same phenomena as quicksand. This is the ocean down here. And stretching up the slope here is the beach. And then behind the beach here is the flat ground behind where you may have a town or people. Thanks, Paul. All right, that's 3. Okay, thank you very much. 3 more. So this is quite a high building next to a rather steep slope.
On a shaking table, Scott subjects his model high-rise to simulated earthquakes of 7 or 8 on the Richter scale, magnitudes easily strong enough to liquefy the earth and turn it to quicksand.
You can see how the building has sunk in and rotated here, mainly because the slope has given way beneath it, and so that's forced it to tilt over this direction. As the shaking progressed, the water pressures built up in the sand underneath the foundation of the bottom block. And as that happened, the ground got softer. And with the shaking and the frequency of the earthquake, it started to get more and more dramatic. And in the end, of course, with the lean coming more and more pronounced, eventually the top blocks just rolled off and fell down the hill.
Just east of Anchorage, Alaska, is Turnagain Arm, a 50-mile-long fjord filled with quicksand. Over the eons, the slow movement of glaciers has ground hard rock from the mountains around the arm into an extremely fine powder. Meltwater carries that powder downstream and into the waters of Turnagain Arm. When the tide retreats, a vast expanse of glacial silt is exposed. In Alaska, they call this the mudflats. But when these tiny particles mix with subsurface water from the incoming tide, this powdered rock has all the properties of deadly quicksand. More than 1 million people visit Alaska every year. Many of them come to enjoy the waters of Turnagain Arm. Most have no idea they are in serious danger of getting stuck. The Lukens family has lived beside Turnagain Arm for 30 years, but despite knowing about the quicksand, they've turned the fjord at low tide into a playground.
We've never had any trouble getting out of the mud. Of course, we don't sit there and see how deeply we can get ourselves embedded either. We try and get out right away and move. As long as you keep moving, you really don't get stuck.
So far, the Lukens have been lucky, but that's not always the case.
But most people are tourists and they go out there and they think that it's a relatively safe area. They play around with it and they notice that it's kind of like jello and they step in it and then they play around with it and then they get one ankle stuck and then they try to pull that out. They get the second ankle stuck and pretty soon they're in up over their knees.
As usual, quicksand is just the trap. In Turnagain Arm, the real killers are the cold water and the enormous tide, the second highest in the world. It is swift and extreme, rising 40 feet in less than 6 hours. Rescuing people from quicksand is tough enough. Trying to beat a racing tide ups the stakes dramatically. 4 times a year, the Girdwood Fire Department runs a thorough simulation to check their gear and make sure every member of the team is ready for a real-life quicksand rescue. Dan Sill is the operations commander.
When we show up on scene, we're going to go out and we're going to evaluate the situation, evaluate the mud and the currents and the tides and the winds and everything else. We'll make a game plan. We'll either set up a person here or here. What's going to be asked.
Everything we do out there, we've trained for it numerous times. Everybody knows what the game plan is, including the victim.
We'll take Bob out there and put him into the mud no more than his knee deep.
There are plenty of suitable areas in Turnagain Arm to stage a drill. Some of the worst quicksand is just off the highway. This silty peninsula, 35 miles east of Anchorage, is perfect for testing the Girdwood team's rescue skills. It has all the hazards they face on real calls, including the debilitating element of cold.
This mud is the same temperature that water is, about 45 degrees, which is really, really cold. And if you're out here without the proper protective equipment on, you're going to get hypothermic. When you struggle to get out of it, you're going to get cold, you're going to get exhausted, and you're going to take and go down and die real quick.
Having the right clothes can make the difference between a successful rescue and a fatality. Full dry suits, life jackets, and helmets protect the men and increase the amount of time they can spend working to free a victim from cold quicksand. Mike Toomey has been with the department for more than a decade. He knows all too well the pressure of trying to rescue someone trapped and in desperate circumstances. In 1988, he witnessed one of the saddest quicksand tragedies in recent Alaskan history.
Mr. and Mrs. Dickinson were newlyweds, and they had a little more gumption than most of us and had chose to spend their honeymoon gold mining up in Seattle Creek, which is just around the corner here. To get there in their four-wheeler, they had to travel across the mudflats.
Jay and Adina Dickinson headed out early in the morning to catch the low tide. Just 300 yards offshore, their four-wheeler bogged down in the silt. Adina jumped off to push from behind. But struggling with the ATV liquefied the ground beneath her feet, and she sank up to her knees. When she stopped moving, the quicksand closed around her legs with an iron grip. Her husband labored frantically, but after 3 hours, he had only managed to free one of Adina's legs. By the time Jay ran for help, the tide was pouring into Turnagain Arm.
About 9 o'clock in the morning, we got a call for a possible victim stuck in the mud. We responded from the station. It's about a half-hour response time to this location. Hiked in the trail with all of our equipment. As I reached the shoreline, I heard the screams of a young woman crying for help. Please don't let me drown. Please save me. There was a woman trapped in the rising waters with the water just below her chin. When I went below the surface to try and feel what was taking place there, I felt her leg, and it seemed to disappear in the sand. And I thought, she's buried all the way up to her knees, you know, probably straight down. And at that point, I tried to tug on her leg, but when I came up, I saw her gasping for breath, so every time I tug her, I pull her under. And each time it's violent. I'm pulling with even more strength now, but each time it's jerking her under the water and thrashing her at the same time. I go under again to try and free her leg, and when I come back up, she's under the water now. The tide's gone over her head, and everything was in a small circle. All I could see was this little area here in front of me, but I'm looking down into her face, and she's under the water, holding her breath. And I'm thinking, you know, what a desperate situation this is. What a, you know, this brave woman, she, despite all the odds, she's gonna stick with us. She's gonna fight with us all the way to the end. Anyway, I didn't know what to do. She's underwater now, and she's holding her breath, and I can't thrash her now because she's got one breath left. At that point, her husband took a tube off their suction dredge, and they stuck it in her mouth. And I stroked her forehead and said, just keep breathing. And I went down again to try and free her leg, and I just pulled as hard as I possibly could, and I just sat there. We got to get her out, you know, pulling as hard as I possibly can, and I couldn't free her.
While Mike struggled beneath the surface, the tide continued to rise. When he finally came up for air, Adina Dickinson had drowned.
It wasn't until low tide later that afternoon, the rescuers that went back to recover her found her still where we'd left her, still trapped just from the knee down by one leg in the mud at an angle like this. The tide had come in, swept over, gone back out with all that force, and that leg was still trapped, snared in that mud. They had to dig her out with shovels.
The tragedy devastated the Girdwood team. On that fateful day, they were beaten by the rising tide and a lack of time. For more than 11 years, they've continued searching for ways to perfect their techniques and speed up their operation.
I literally spent months and months dreaming and fantasizing about a tool that I could build that I could expedite the rescue, and literally in minutes.
What Dan Sill came up with turned the Girdwood team's greatest enemy into their most important ally. Water became the key component in their fight against the clock. For everything to work, the floating pump which capitalizes on the water around them must be kept running.
I just want you guys to make certain if something does happen and does go wrong that we are relying on you, so that no matter what it takes, that pump is your responsibility. You cannot let it shut off. I don't want to freak you out or anything, but once Bob's in the mud, he's our responsibility. So we're not going to let him die.
Okay, I'm up to my knees.
All right. Feel like we're sinking anymore?
A little. I'm ready. You ready?
I'm ready.
Go ahead, fire it up.
The float-a-pump sucks water up through the hose and into a long, perforated metal tube.
Here we go.
High-pressure blasts of water liquefy the dense quicksand and unlock the grip on Bob's legs. With the new device, the extrication takes less than a minute. After each run-through, the team gathers for a debriefing.
I could not move my legs. It felt like cement was around them. And the more I tried, before Scott was there, I was just kind of playing around. The more I tried, the further I was sinking.
Mm-hmm. The thing is, what typically people do, and I was watching you do that, is they'll get one foot stuck, so they'll try to pull this one out. This one goes deeper.
Yeah.
Then they realize that, and they go, I'll stand on this foot, and they'll try to pull that out. Then that one goes deeper. So they're caught in a seesaw motion where they're going back and forth, and they actually forcing themselves to get deep.
So once both feet are in, what are you going to do if you can't get either one of them out?
Concentrate on one foot. Wiggle one foot to get one foot out. That foot gets on the highest piece of ground that you can find. Then you work on that one. And vibration is what will get it out.
And what if both are in and you aren't getting them to move at all?
You need to fall forward on your belly. Get all your weight off. Sometimes it's not possible because you're up to your knees. What you have to do is get the weight off of one point and work to get one leg out or one foot out. Roll until you can get the other one out. Do a roll and run for high ground.
The bottom line is you shouldn't be out there. There's nothing for you out there. It is just nothing but danger. And I've said it again and said it before, you're flirting with the devil. You're literally flirting with the devil.
Sadly, Dan and his colleagues, along with rescuers around the world, fight that devil all too often. Quicksand by itself is not the killer, but locked in its relentless grip, any one of its accomplices, time, tide, cold, or heat, can finish us off. Again and again, we seem to ignore the warning signs and fall prey to one of the world's most insidious traps. Quicksand can be found almost anywhere, so the safest bet is to watch your step.